Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anthony Cox and I'm the Deputy Director for the Environment Directorate here at the OECD, and welcome to today's OECD Green Talk Live on the topic of managing diffuse source water pollution. Now, improving water quality and protecting ecosystems is a key target under the Sustainable Development Goal number 6, which deals with water. And considerable attention has been given in recent decades to increasing investment in wastewater treatment plants and the control of point source pollution. But despite these efforts, water quality in most OECD countries still continues to deteriorate. So it's therefore very timely that we have a look at how we can encourage governments and provide advice and guidance to governments on how they can tackle the challenge of more effectively managing diffuse source water pollution. It's my pleasure to welcome Hannah Leckie, who is an analyst at the OECD Environment Directorate and who leads our work on water quality, to talk about diffuse source water pollution, what that really is, what the consequences of not addressing it are, and what policy solutions we can advocate to overcome the problems. Now, Hannah's going to talk for about 25 minutes on the topic, drawing on the key messages of the recently released report, Diffuse Pollution, Degraded Waters, Emerging Policy Solutions, which is right here. Afterwards, there'll be roughly half an hour for questions to Hannah. For those of you online today, our apologies for the delay in the start, but please feel free to send questions to OECD Environment via the webinar website, and I will convey them to Hannah. This is our chance for those online and those in the room here to dig deeper into this subject. The webinar will be recorded and will be available on the OECD's website after the Green Talk. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Hannah and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Good afternoon, everybody, both to you in the room and those online. It's great to have you here. So this talk conveys some of the key messages of a report on the economics of water quality that was triggered by a growing concern of water quality from our OECD member countries, and also their demand for policy guidance on how to implement more economically efficient and environmentally effective policies to improve water quality. The report showcases a number of case studies submitted by country delegates and experts and builds on discussions held at an OECD workshop last year. So just briefly, I'd like to cover what the water quality challenge is, what is diffuse source water pollution, the economic case for policy action and some numbers around the consequences of not acting on it, emerging policy solutions, delving deep into a couple of case studies, a framework for diffuse pollution management, and finally the role that central government can play. So we know from the literature that water quality is a global issue. At least half of the world's population suffers from water pollution, and freshwater biodiversity has drastically declined by 81% between 1970 and 2012, and that's more than any other type of ecosystem. This figure maps the pollution of nutrient and pesticide loading, mercury deposition, salinization, acidification, and sediment and organic loading all together. Pollution hotspots, as you can see, are identified in all regions of the world, including OECD countries. One of the main water quality challenges facing OECD countries is the effective management of diffuse source water pollution. So what is diffuse source water pollution? Well, we commonly characterize water pollutants as either point or source or diffuse according to their source and pathway to the receiving environment. And this distinction is an important function of water quality policy and pollution regulation. So point sources of pollution are directly discharged to the receiving environment at a discrete location, such as pipes from wastewater treatment plants. They're easy to identify and more cost effective to quantify, manage and regulate. On the other hand, diffuse sources of pollution are indirectly discharged to receiving water bodies via runoff from land surfaces, from atmospheric deposition, and leaching through the soil down to groundwater during periods of rainfall and irrigation. Examples include nutrient runoff and leaching from the use of fertilizers or from urine patches from cows and other livestock. It includes atmospheric deposition of nitrogen oxides from your car emissions, and also stormwater runoff of heavy metals and hydrocarbons from city pavements. Diffuse sources of pollution are challenging to monitor and regulate because there are so many different sources that vary in time and in space. Political resistance to regulate diffuse pollution and to apply the polluter pays principle have also hindered more stringent action. So in general, OECD countries have tackled the problem of access to sanitation services and point source pollution. This graph here demonstrates the high percentage of the population connected to a wastewater treatment plant in OECD countries. But despite this, water quality challenges remain. This figure illustrates that diffuse pollution from agriculture is often the main source of nutrient pollution in many OECD countries. In Ireland, Denmark and New Zealand, around 80% of nutrient pollution is from agriculture. And this is what too many nutrients combined with the right amount of sunlight and warm temperatures can look like. Globally, the most prevalent water quality challenge is considered to be eutrophication from excess nutrients, which can trigger toxic algae blooms, contributes to dead zones in the ocean, and can cause nitrate toxicity in groundwater and drinking water. So these pictures here are of a toxic algae bloom last summer off the coast of Florida in the US. This economic and environmental disaster stemmed from a lack of enforcement of required nutrient pollution limits. So why does this matter? Well, poor water quality has many economic, social and environmental costs associated with it, including water treatment and health-related costs, degradation of ecosystem services, both freshwater and marine, impacts on economic activities such as agriculture, fisheries, industrial manufacturing and tourism, reduced property values, and opportunity costs of further development due to water not being suitable for use because it is too polluted. The cumulative impacts of diffuse water pollution can be devastating for human well-being and ecosystem health. Ultimately, they can undermine sustainable economic growth. These estimates demonstrate that the cost of inaction is high, and these are annual costs. For example, the cost of nitrogen pollution on freshwater ecosystems in the United States is estimated at $78 billion per year. Uncertainty is high in these calculations due to the difficulty in determining non-use values of water quality, but they do illustrate a point. The scale of these costs means that seeking increasingly marginal reductions in point source pollution is no longer the most cost-effective approach to improving water quality in many OECD countries. As such, there's a growing and strong case for a shift in focus to diffuse pollution prevention and integration with point source management. So what policy tools do we have available? Policy instruments to manage water pollution typically fall into one of three categories. Firstly, regulatory instruments, for example, bans on harmful chemicals, capping pollution based on computer modelling, land retirement, and planning requirements such as nutrient budgets. The second type of instrument is economic instruments. Examples include taxes on fertiliser or pesticides, sewer surcharges, and payments for practices that reduce pollution and encourage innovation and uptake of new technologies. The third type of instrument are voluntary and information instruments. These include advisory services that foster environmental stewardship and best environmental practices, and includes environmental labelling schemes on food products and other products that we buy. An important point to note is that water quality and quantity are linked and should be managed together. Water that is too polluted can exacerbate the problem of water scarcity. Water scarcity reduces the capacity for dilution of point source pollution, and it also increases water temperature, which can encourage toxic algae blooms. In contrast, high rainfall events and flooding increases diffuse pollution and can trigger combined sewer overflows. So here you can start to see that it's important to understand that we manage not only water quality, but to combine that with water quantity management. To date, in OECD countries, the most common policy instrument approach has been voluntary payments and compliance measures to address diffuse water pollution. However, there's evidence that voluntary participation may not reach the major polluters, and subsidy-based programs can have limited impact due to public budget constraints and a lack of environmental regulations on diffuse pollution. There are, however, some emerging innovative policies that in the OECD that could be adapted and scaled up to more effectively manage diffuse pollution. For example, Norway has a tax on pesticides that attempts to reflect the environmental and health-related risks and costs of pesticides. The tax has been successful in encouraging more conservative use of them. In France, taxes apply to diffuse pollution from livestock, and these taxes are calculated based on the number, the type, and the age of livestock. England has a number of payment for ecosystem services schemes where water utilities work with upstream farmers to develop water management plans to reduce nutrients, pesticides, and sediments. In doing so, they reduce drinking water treatment costs. The Lake Taupo nitrogen market in New Zealand is the world's first water quality trading scheme between diffuse source polluters. It enables farmers within a catchment to exchange nutrient allocations. This provides flexibility for land to move to its highest value and best use and still meet overall nitrogen load reduction targets. I'd like to zoom in on two case studies that I think are particularly innovative: nutrient allocation in New Zealand and water quality trading in the US. So one of the greatest challenges of regulating nutrient losses from diffuse sources is determining and allocating limits in a way that is equitable and cost efficient. The limit setting processes in place for tackling diffuse nitrogen losses typically fall in two distinct camps. One, those based on land use practices. For example, controlling the use of fertilizers and pesticides, setting limits on previous levels of pollution, known as grandparenting, or having limits on land use practices based on different farming sectors. And the other camp is those independent of current land use. For example, an equal allocation of pollution limits per hectare of land, or allocating pollution loads based on the underlying natural capital of the soil. The efficiency and equity of each allocation approach differs based on their existing land use, land characteristics, stakeholder preferences, and the stringency of the regulation. It's important to ensure that polluters are not rewarded, that pollution is reduced at lowest cost, and that opportunity costs are accounted for. For example, policy linked to current land use can protect existing infrastructure, but can reward high polluters. So in New Zealand, diffuse pollution management is receiving considerable attention. A relatively new national policy statement requires regional authorities to set water quality objectives in all water bodies and to set pollution limits to achieve them by 2025 or 2030 at the latest. This includes setting nutrient loss limits. Many regions have used water quality modelling to inform policy design and to allocate nutrient loss limits. Land managers can innovate farm and land management practices within their pollution allocation without being restricted by the inputs or farming practices they wish to use. In other words, it encourages innovation. In the Manawatu-Whanganui region, nutrient loss limits have been allocated to individual farmers using the National Water Quality Model based on the natural capital of the soil and its ability to filter and retain water and nutrients, independent of whatever type of farming the land is used for. This table shows that the higher the class of the soil, the greater allocation of nutrient pollution. So if you are a farmer with a large proportion of your land on high quality, versatile soils, you are entitled to a greater nutrient allocation than a farmer that has a lot of shallow, permeable soils that easily leaches nutrients down to the groundwater. Such an approach encourages the adaptation of land activity to better use soil and water resources and shifts land use activities to more sustainable and productive outcomes based on the underlying natural capital stocks of soils. In the United States, in Chesapeake Bay, which is one of the largest and most productive estuaries in the world, it's suffered from excess nutrients and sediment for decades. After voluntary attempts at improving water quality were unsuccessful in substantially improving water quality, the Environmental Protection Agency allocated nutrient reduction requirements in 2010 to the states of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. Reduction requirements were calibrated using a water quality model and allocated based on the pollution contribution of each state. Following this, each state allocated reductions to individual pollution sources within their jurisdiction. There are no allocations for future growth, so all new sources of pollution loads must be offset. This graph here shows that the costs of nitrogen mitigation varies greatly among different sectors. Mitigation of agricultural diffuse source pollution, for example with cover crops or conservation tillage, restoring wetlands, has significantly lower costs than mitigation of point sources such as upgrading wastewater treatment plants. Based on these dramatic price differentials, water quality trading has emerged as a market-based mechanism for cost-effectively meeting water quality goals. In other words, reducing pollution where it's cheapest. Regulated entities and new and expanding facilities can offset their pollution loads by purchasing credits from other entities at lower cost than could be attained on site. Given that there are no pollution load allocations for future growth, trading is considered to be a critical mechanism for accommodating growth through acquiring pollution offsets. Based on experiences from Chesapeake Bay and elsewhere on water quality trading, we've developed what we think are some requisites for a viable trading scheme. Binding regulatory limits on pollution levels are essential for trading activity to occur. Cost efficiency and equity should be considered when allocating pollution limits. Trading activity requires sufficiently large differences in pollution control costs between polluters. Trading rules should be clearly established to ensure that water quality goals will be satisfied, but also be designed to facilitate trading at low cost. And successful trading requires the development of institutions for organising trade and making sure that they are trusted by and effective for intended program participants. This includes stakeholder engagement to create buy-in. So in the report, we've developed a framework to manage diffuse source water pollution that builds on a risk-based approach. The first step is to know the risks, to identify the pollutants, their sources, their pathways, timing, and the sensitivity of the receiving environment. The second step is to target the risks. It's not possible to prevent or control all sources of pollution. Determining the acceptable level of risk and ambition of water quality goals through robust economic, social, and environmental assessments is necessary. Stakeholder engagement can assist in prioritising and targeting high water quality risks. And the third step is to manage the risks by developing policy responses in proportion to the magnitude of the risks accepted and assigning the risks at least cost to society. An optimal approach will likely entail a mix of regulatory, economic and voluntary policy instruments. And monitoring and evaluation of policy implementation and reassessment of the risk will be necessary in order to adapt to change. This is because changes to the climate, population dynamics, economic growth, evolving priorities, and advances in science and technology make achieving and maintaining water quality a moving target. So because it is not economical to observe diffuse water pollution directly, like it is with pollution coming straight out of a pipe where we can put on a water quality meter, the choice and design of policy instruments have to build upon one of three alternative management options. The first option is to manage land use practices and inputs as proxies, such as requiring soil erosion control practices and restricting fertiliser use. The second management option is to reward or penalise land managers collectively within a catchment based on downstream changes in water quality. However, this approach transfers the burden and difficulties of the measurement of diffuse pollution from regulators to the individual polluters. And the third option is to manage estimated diffuse emissions via computer modelling. This approach allows land managers to innovate farm and land management practices within a pollution limit without being restricted by the inputs and land use practices that they use. However, this approach relies on a robust, calibrated and validated model and reliable input data. And the last part of the framework talks about policy principles to guide decision making. The principle of pollution prevention is based on the merit that the cost of cleaning up pollution is often greater than its prevention. This means preventing pollutants from reaching water bodies through recovery and reuse of wastewater, product substitution, best land management practices, and retirement of land. The principle of treatment at source considers that pollution control measures should be applied as close as possible to the source. In effect, the later the stage of control, the less effective it is likely to be due to wider dispersion of the contaminants. This is particularly important for toxic substances which are persistent in the environment or that can bioaccumulate. For example, heavy metals and pesticides. The polluter pays principle requires producers to pay the full cost of their production process, including externalities. This should be the first line of defence in securing water quality and incentivising behaviour change, for example, through water pollution charges, taxes, and water quality trading. The beneficiary pays principle requires those who benefit from water quality improvements to pay for the costs incurred to do so. For example, payment for ecosystem services schemes. Polluters should first comply with baseline regulations before payments are made to ensure additionality and prevent polluters being rewarded. Equity should be considered with regards to who the costs and benefits of policy reform fall upon and the needs of future generations. Policy coherence is required to ensure initiatives taken by different policy sectors do not have negative impacts on water quality. This means removing subsidies that encourage land use change or intensification that can result in diffuse water pollution. It also means looking for win-win solutions such as nitrous oxide reductions to improve air quality, water quality, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions all at the same time. It also means integrating water pollution control, both point and source, with air pollution control, land use management and planning, and water quantity management. And lastly, the OECD water governance principles are also relevant. In particular, managing water at the appropriate scale to account for point and diffuse sources of pollution, including atmospheric sources of pollution which may not fit within the boundary of a catchment. And lastly, central government has a critical role to play in the transition to more effective management of diffuse source pollution. This includes strong overarching regulatory frameworks, enforced minimum water quality standards, stakeholder engagement to manage perceived and actual risks and to reach solutions in partnership, giving notice of policy changes and providing multiple options for implementation, and providing seed funding to initiate experimental projects. In doing so, government sends the right signals to local authorities, to stakeholders, to investors. It encourages innovation and minimises the cost of water quality management for society as a whole. If you would like further information, you can download the report or the policy highlights from our website. Thank you very much for listening in, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Hannah. And it was very good to see the example of New Zealand used there, which was part of the discussion or part of the report on the environmental performance review of New Zealand that was released 2 weeks ago, where water was one of the special chapters there. So there's and water quality is a key issue, a key policy issue in New Zealand at the moment. So it was very timely. So it's time for questions, comments, discussions from those in the room here and those online. If you are online, don't hesitate to send us in some questions, and we'll flick them to Hannah. But in the meantime, do we have questions from the room? Or I might start with one off the top, just to get us going. Hannah, the report's very much around OECD countries, but does it cover developing countries as well? Are the kind of recommendations you advocate for OECD countries able to be adapted for developing countries, particularly sophisticated instruments that you've focused on, like water quality trading schemes? I mean, it's hard enough to put those in OECD countries. How feasible is it to do these kind of economic instruments in the developing world?
Thanks, Anthony. Well, we looked at originally at the scope of this project, we looked at covering BRICS countries, emerging economies, but the priorities we figured out are quite different to the water quality priorities between developing and emerging economies. So the highest priority for developing and emerging economies is to gain universal access to sanitation services. It's a human right. It's one of the sustainable development goals. And so the priority there is to increase coverage of wastewater treatment plants. But in doing so, these countries are also going to be have the double challenge of not only that, but also managing diffuse source pollution. And we hope that some of the messages from this report can also apply to these countries.
Okay, thanks. Are there any questions from inside the room? Who wants to go first? Can you please identify yourself and...
Josefin Holmqvist from the Swedish OECD delegation. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm not at all a water expert, but I find this very, very interesting. I saw you mentioned Sweden in one of the slides, our high costs for the Baltic Sea, and this is a sea that we share with a number of other countries, some OECD members and some outside, and we have a lot of regional cooperation in this area. But have you looked a bit of the problems when you have a shared problem and how you can handle that? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So we haven't covered transboundary management within the report. It's a sensitive issue for our countries. But there are lessons that can be learned from, example, the US case study of water quality trading. There, in the US, responsibility for water quality is given down to the states. And so in a way, that's transboundary management of Chesapeake Bay. It's important to have get together and have stakeholder consultation. There's the OECD water governance principles can help with that. They've got also have engagement principles, stakeholder engagement principles and indicators. Do you want to say anything, Xavier?
Anna is right to say that we haven't dig deeper into the issue of transboundary management, but we think that some of the tools and analytical tools in particular that we promoted can help advance debates and cooperation among countries. In particular, we think economic analysis can help make the case for more intense cooperation for transboundary water management. It can also help understand who wins and who loses from different measures, and it can help identify or it can help design tools that can reallocate the wins or the losses between countries. So although we haven't investigated that in much detail, I think some of the messages and some of the tools which are proposed in the report can substantiate international cooperation for transboundary waters. That said, we are fully aware that it's a very tricky and politically loaded question. That may explain why we haven't investigated it further.
Thanks, Hannah and Xavier. Matthew.
Hi, I'm Matthew Griffiths from the Environment Directorate, and just say thank you very much. Really interesting presentation and very well delivered. So well done, and hopefully I can get a copy of the report off you. One of the solutions you mentioned was with regard to computer modeling. And I wondered if you, in your study, if you came across any examples of where that's well used and used well, and who owns it and who's responsible for collecting the data and enforcing the findings.
So I can talk to the case of New Zealand on this. New Zealand have developed a nationwide water quality model that can be taken up by each of the regional authorities and applied at the right from the farmer scale all the way up to the regional catchment scale. The model is, I believe, owned by the New Zealand government with funding from the New Zealand government. And the regional authorities are using the model to inform policy and to inform them on future scenarios of what happens if we intensify land use further. And the model is continuously had more and more research put into it to upgrade it. And that's one important part of models, is that they should continuously be upgraded to take into account new and innovative mitigation approaches so that they are factored into the model, and that these innovative approaches are encouraged. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions from online. First is, do you have any good examples of the use of the polluter pays principle? I know it's something the OECD has been advocating since the early 1970s as one of our founding principles in the environment toolkit. But do you have a really good, crisp example of where this works? And the other question that came in from the same participant was about the role of codes of conduct as a means of trying to get better, more environmentally sensitive behaviour on the parts of farmers and others. Do you have examples of where the codes of conduct work well?
Thank you for whoever's question that was online. Polluter pays principle. So we haven't seen many examples of all externalities being taken into account, negative externalities with water pollution. And we've discovered a few different barriers to fully implementing the polluter pays principle in OECD countries. Barriers including the obvious one of the difficulty of identifying and targeting diffuse polluters. There's also difficulties with determining reliable estimates of pollution costs, so economic evaluation and the uncertainties around that. There's also often poor enforcement of existing regulations and strong political opposition to putting in place the polluter pays principle. We've also identified a number of solutions that can particularly overcome these barriers. This is where water quality modelling can come in. It's costs a lot less than going in and putting out lysimeters, for example, which look at the water pollution moving through the soil profile down to the groundwater based on the soil type, which can be very science intensive. So water quality modelling is a cost-effective alternative. Taxes on inputs is another option. We've seen in, I mentioned Norway. There's also, you can put taxes on the land use. For example, France has a tax on paved urban surfaces. So if you're a developer and you want to go and put in more roads and pavements, then you have to pay to offset some of the stormwater management costs. And then I also mentioned, taxes on livestock numbers in France. There's also the option of market mechanisms which can reveal pollution costs and differentiated abilities to cope with them, rather than trying to determine the costs, which has problems with valuation. And then with stakeholder engagement and awareness by the public, that can help make the case for political action and use of the polluter pays principle. And also connecting with high-level policy priorities, for example, on health, if there's going to be substantial health-related effects, as well as impacts to biodiversity, that can help create a case for more targeted action and use of the polluter pays principle. As far as code of conduct goes, we've seen also in New Zealand a collaborative process, and I talk about New Zealand because I was involved in the New Zealand EPR, so it's on my mind. But New Zealand encourages a collaborative governance approach, and that gets community members all around the table that have various vested interests, and they try to reflect a balanced range of all of these interests, values and investments. And there's a national collaborative governance guidelines that can be used at the regional and community levels, and ultimately it's solutions are being created in partnership with community members, and I think that's a good example of having a good code of conduct, and assessing and managing the risks and getting stakeholder buy-in.
The questions from down the corner there. Yes, thanks.
Thank you. Joël Lyon from the Trade and Agriculture Directorate, Natural Resources Policies Division. I had a question on the role of the private sector and codes of conduct and leading to policy. There are good examples of water companies inciting farmers around their wells to use good practices to avoid diffuse pollution. Do you think those are good examples of incitement that public sector could take on, or is it just too costly for a public sector policy?
I think catchment protection involving the private sector is a critical part of managing water quality. They should definitely have a seat at the table to express what their values are and their interests. When we look at what's happening in the UK, a lot of the utilities are privately owned, and they have a vested interest to protect their water sources which they supply for public use, and to also to their customers to produce that water at the lowest cost possible. So in the UK, you're seeing a lot of these utilities now working with farmers in the community, trying to educate them to reduce their nutrient losses, their pesticides, which are very costly to remove in water treatment processes. So yes, there is a role for the private sector in combination with all the other community interests.
Hannah, we've seen an increasing interest in the so-called emerging pollutants or pollutants of emerging concern, things like nanomaterials, microplastics, medications, and so on. Is the kind of policy framework you're advocating here going to be able to pick up these emerging concerns with changes in technology and so on?
Thanks, Anthony. Yes, I mean, the risk-based approach is definitely going to be applicable to the management of contaminants of emerging concern. But also this is going to be a new area of work for us, and it's not what this report focuses on. But we have had a lot of interest from our OECD member countries to look more closely at the impacts of things like antibiotics, different other pharmaceuticals, hormones, as you say, microplastics, nanomaterials, all the personal products that you use in day-to-day life, ending up in the water system, the effects that has on the environment and on human health, and then how we can manage these under increasing under scientific uncertainty, with increasing number of chemicals being used in day-to-day life. So for us, that's the focus of the next couple of years in the Environment Directorate here.
I guess a critical issue there is knowing the risks. So I think the pathways into the environment and the impacts are still very much unknown. Kathleen.
Kathleen Dominique from the Environment Directorate. Hannah, thanks for the excellent presentation, extremely clear and interesting. I have a question about the policy principles. You mentioned, of course, the polluter pays principle and also the beneficiary pays principle. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about how governments can try to draw the line between how much they want to make the polluter pay versus how much responsibility they put on the beneficiaries of water quality improvements? If you have some thoughts on where that line can be drawn and how that's been applied in practice, that would be interesting.
Thanks, Kathleen. So where to draw the line, that's something that will differ based on local circumstances and priorities. But as far as trade-offs go, we recommend that the polluter pays principle be the first line of defence to ensure that externalities are accounted for. And then the beneficiary pays is also still a good approach as long as there are minimum regulatory standards that must be met before payments are given, because otherwise you end up not having any additionality and rewarding these polluters that weren't already practicing good practices. So essentially sending the wrong signal. So I think that's a discussion that has to be held based on local circumstances.
Okay, more questions. Delphine.
Delphine Clavel from the OECD Water Governance Program. Thanks, Hannah, for a very interesting presentation. I have a question related to the first recommendation that you suggest as to the role of central government, and that has to do with how part of their responsibility is to send the right signal to the local authorities and also to distribute responsibility to the local governments. So I would be interested to know what you see as what these responsibilities should be. And I would add actually to local governments what you think also is a responsibility of river basin organizations, for instance, and whether you have in mind suggestions or examples from your case studies about how these responsibilities at the subnational level could be coordinated effectively with the central government so as to avoid incoherence and overlaps.
Thank you, Delphine. So often water in general, but also water quality, is managed at the local level, and we support a catchment-based approach because with diffuse pollution there'll be a variety of land uses within a catchment that will differ from one catchment to another. And so ultimately diffuse pollution needs to be managed at the catchment level with the exception of atmospheric sources if they are a main culprit of pollution within a catchment.
The role of coordination between subnational and national.
Yeah, so the role of coordination between national and subnational. The water quality policies are best developed at the catchment level by regional and local authorities. But it helps if national government have some overarching guidance to support that. For example, if you have community interests get around the table and they're missing work, then they should be well supported financially. There should be independent scientific and economic analyses to inform decision making and that kind of support from national government. At the same time, there may be great emerging innovative solutions that evolve at the catchment level that could be applied elsewhere. And so there needs to be coordination and communications between all the levels of government to share such practices and to inform, in some cases, decision making at the national level.
Just to add on to that, I think one of the overarching benefits of a national approach are probably to reduce the competition between catchment areas, between administrative districts on the basis of water quality in terms of decreasing water quality. So trying to attract economic activity at the expense of the natural environment. So having some minimum national standards in place prevent that kind of competition and promote a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. So we going to ask a question? Okay, please go ahead.
My name is Sarah Finke from the Environment Directorate. Thanks, Hannah, for the very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a question on the next steps. Anthony mentioned at the beginning this work is highly relevant for the SDG number 6, and OECD is in the process of supporting its members and also non-members in the implementation of SDGs. So what is planned now after the report has been issued in terms of next steps in such support? And also one key aspect which members often are quite concerned about is duplication of efforts. So how would the OECD work in that regard fit in with work of other actors, especially other international organizations? Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. So next steps will be to disseminate these key messages of the report at a range of international workshops and conferences. But going forward, this report and the messages that came out of it helped inform the OECD Council recommendation on water, which is something all our OECD members have adhered to, and there's a section on water quality here. And this was adopted last year and will be assessed, progress will be assessed against it with OECD countries in a few years' time. There's also potential for this work to inform national policy dialogues that we have with specific countries, which is demand-driven based on their needs. Also with our environmental performance reviews. And then with our next program of work on contaminants of emerging concern, to avoid duplication, we're going to be working with a number of key partners to ensure that there's no duplication, but also to work with the scientific community because we're not scientific experts, and bridging that gap between science and policy.
Okay, we've come to the end of our scheduled time. It's 2 o'clock, so I think we'll draw it to a close. I'd like to thank Hannah for a very interesting and relevant and timely presentation, and congratulations again on the report, which you can download from the website, which is on the screen there. I'd like to thank all those in the room here, as well as those online, for their participation and the questions and comments and discussion. I'd just like to advertise that the next OECD Green Talk Live is on the 28th of April and the topic will be the challenges of green finance, which is another area the OECD has been heavily engaged in the last few years. So Hannah, thanks again, and congratulations on the report, and we'll see you again at the next OECD Green Talk Live. Thank you.